What's up, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I have a great guest. Before I get to the guest, make sure that you go to the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share, follow, subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Make sure that you send it to everyone so that they're informed of what's going on as well. And I want to bring in my guests. I have Dave Collum, professor of organic chemistry, and I really look forward to this conversation because I've been following his Twitter feed. And he really puts out some of the best tweets you could imagine. I'll have links up to his Twitter feed on the PAS Report website. Dave, welcome to the program. How are you?
Hey, it's a pleasure. I'd like to ask you for my Twitter feed to give me a thumbnail sketch of who you are so they know who they're listening to.
See, now the interview turns on me. Look at that.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I am someone that is a professor of political science, and I've been hosting the PAS Report for about 4 years now. I come from the real world, so I'm not fully embedded in the academic bubble. I used to be in Homeland Security and emergency management before I went full-time into teaching, but I enjoy the classroom. I enjoy the
So
students.
where'd you teach? Where'd you teach?
I teach over at Suffolk County Community College.
Okay. And what do you teach? What subject?
Political science, American government, and international politics.
Okay. I might ask you a few questions.
Oh, you can ask me questions throughout this interview. I want this to be a free flow conversation. That's how I do it. I want to hear your thoughts and your opinions on what's going on, because one of the things that I latched onto when it comes to certain information that you put out there is that there's this real disconnect between people, the economy, and the politicians. And in a tweet last week, you explained about, yeah, the GDP numbers on the surface level, they may look good, 3.5% growth in a quarter. It sounds nice,
Right.
But what's the truth behind it?
Well, the truth behind it is, since it's inflation corrected, whatever's wrong with the inflation numbers is wrong with the GDP for starters. And the inflation numbers are probably up by a factor of 2, if not an order of magnitude. If you go to the Chapwood Index, that's one of my favorite inflation indices. Chapwood Index, Google that, you'll find inflation numbers for 10 biggest cities in the country, 500 different purchases. If you just look at money supply changes, it's clear inflation is running wild. And so if you correct for inflation, one could argue we've had a negative GDP for many years, actually. One could argue we've been in a contracting economy and that we're just pretending. And so I also think that the quality of the GDP numbers not very good. So a big percentage of it, for example, is healthcare. And healthcare is not gross domestic product. It's the cost of keeping a rapidly depreciating asset on the road. So if you had a car that you had to fix every week, would that be considered a positive or negative? If we were all healthy and we never had to go to a doctor, would that be a net gain? And the answer is yes. So I don't see how you get to count healthcare in the GDP number. I also look at where the GDP is coming from, and they're coming from companies that I look at and I go, those are not exactly Standard Oil, and they're not exactly Carnegie and various things. They look like there's a lot of fluff in them. If Facebook went away today, what would we lose? If Nvidia went away today, we'd probably gain, in my opinion. I think their chips are probably going to be used for nefarious purposes. So.
Well, it is amazing. And Facebook, obviously, you're right. It would be a net benefit if we lost it. And with NVIDIA, I mean, I remember the stock being at $80, and I was thinking maybe I should buy some of that stock. Now it's up to $680. So I kind of kicked myself in the butt for that. But it does seem like everything's overinflated. I mean, when we look at the drivers within the stock market, it's interesting because everyone's touting the market, but yet 401ks are actually still down. IRAs are actually still down. It's only a handful of stocks that are really behind this market. Then you look over at credit card debt, and you see credit card debt is now at all-time highs. You see a major increase in people defaulting on credit card debt. And this increase to me is very troubling. You see defaults on mortgages increasing. The commercial real estate is going to be a disaster within the next year.
Boom.
Yeah. And when we take that, something that you put out there a couple of days ago was that sooner or later, the real market begins to emerge.
Mhm.
Now, when do you think that's going to be? I mean, we are in election year, so they're going to try and put as many band-aids to plug as many holes as they can. But when do you think the real economy is going to emerge, and how bad do you think it's going to be?
Well, I have the markets using 25-ish metrics of valuation, around 120, 150% overvalued. So by my math, to get back to historical norm, we'd have to drop maybe 60%. And so people say, well, you've been saying that for a long time. And I go, yeah, actually they kind of left orbit in 94 and just went higher and higher above historical norm nonstop. And you go, well, then you're wrong. Or we're heading for a period of great pain and suffering. So, the Nikkei went up, pretty much every year from 1945 to 1989. And then it's now been a complete disaster for the next, 35 years. So I wrote a piece arguing for a 40-year bear market. And it'll have ups and downs. It'll have what people call bear markets and bull markets inside it. My prediction is that 40 years from now, you'll look up and you'll say, wow, the market's inflation adjusted didn't go anywhere. We'll tread water for 40 years by a path that's totally unknown. But we compounded our valuation over those 40 years by 3% a year, compounded the valuation, which is an inherently inflation adjusted metric, right? It's not a price, it's a valuation. And at 3% a year. So if the next 40 years it compounds at negative 3% a year, the 3% tailwind turned into a 3% headwind. That's not an investable market. And so I don't know when it'll start. It feels like it's kind of starting. It'll start out anecdotally. It'll be one of these things where you're told everything is fine. You go, well, we just lost another bank, or we just lost another $100 million office complex that they dropped the keys off to JP Morgan. And so it's going to be stuff like that where the anecdotes seem to not match up with the stats. The jobs numbers, for example, I don't think there's an economist in the world who thinks the job numbers are legit. And
No, definitely not.
when they tore them apart, I mean, it turns out the number of hours worked was actually lower, even though the job numbers came in strong. And I saw a great meme said Biden, the world's so great, country's in such great shape, everyone's working twice as many jobs. I go, yeah,
Well,
that's
it's
pretty
true.
true. I know. I was working 2 jobs. So I think we're going to pay. There's never been a market in history that stayed overvalued by definition, right? That's kind of a gravity argument. And so this one won't stay overvalued either. We will have some period in the next, I don't know how many decades, where we will be cheap. The markets will be well below fair value,
Now,
historical fair value.
do you think that there's still the safe places in the market that haven't been overvalued because they're not the tech, it's not the Apples or the Nvidias or the Facebooks? Well, Apple actually produces something that's been useful so far, but we'll see where it goes.
Except for the fact that they're up something like 600% with their revenues up 60%.
Yeah.
So Apple can produce all the good stuff. If you bought a Toyota, you'd say, well, that's a good car. And I go, yeah, but I paid 110,000 for it. Right.
Then it's not so good.
Right. And so if you actually look at Microsoft, for example, the last 10-fold gain of Microsoft, 5-fold of it was valuation expansion. They went up 2-fold due to their ability to create more wealth, apparently. I'm not sure how. I'm not sure I believe those numbers, but 5-fold was just valuation expansion, going from, we'll call it P of 9 to 36 or something. It's that will be given back. That will be given back.
Now, when you say a 60% correction sooner or later, the Great Depression, I believe, was around 30% that the market dropped in the crash.
No, around 90 actually, from 29 to 33.
I'm talking about the initial drop, 30%.
Oh yeah. So what happens is there's a muscle memory. Bill Fleckenstein uses the muscle memory language, which makes sense. Where early attempts to correct the dip buyers just keep showing up. The way you correct the market is you correct two things. One is price. You have to correct it in earnest. You really do have to get rid of the excess. And the second thing, to do that, you have to correct attitude. And the attitude is the slow one to correct. So what will happen is the market will drop, the dip buyers will come in. So they first get knocked on their ass, they get right up, they buy, they say, yeah, great opportunity. They get knocked on their ass again, they buy again. And at some point they'll reach a point like in the Nikkei where it took 20 years to drop, 20 years of false rallies before it finally plumbed what we hope is the bottom. Right?
You think that's the lost generation right there.
Yeah, and that is the lost generation. That's exactly. So the Nikkei, if you average down, it took something like 22 years to break even, averaging down. If you had nothing at the top, if you were a 22-year-old Japanese kid and you just start buying the Nikkei in 1989 and you just average your way down, 22 years to break even. That's half your investing life.
Yeah, there's no recovering from that.
Well, I would argue if you're going to have a period of, if you're going to have a 20-year period that's bad and a 20-year period that's good, you want the bad period first.
I agree.
The youngest kids now could be looking at opportunity if we grind ourselves down to a bloody stump over the next 20 years while they aggressively save. And then once the money's, if you get a tenfold run in the market, the one thing you don't want to have is that happen when you haven't yet gotten money into the market. Yeah, right? Well, so you really want the second 20 to be the good one.
Agreed. And trying to time the markets is never easy. But I mean, we have this picture of a failing economy, and it's not just the United States. When we look at the global economy, I mean, you're seeing the struggles, whether it's
China, right? Correct. China's a wipeout right now. China's interesting. If you look at rising emerging markets, US 1870 to 1929, Japan 1945 to 1989, you get this kind of half of a century of Cinderella, right? Of a Goldilocks, where you emerge from nothing to something very grand, and then you have a very serious payback period while you digest all those gains. And one could argue that China's maybe they're now going to struggle for a number of decades to sort of put themselves back together after building a huge sort of debt-based, credit-based story.
Yeah, and it raises an interesting question about what happens and how do people react in China. I mean, we look at it, you have about 600 million Chinese people that were brought out of the depths of poverty during this period. I don't think they want to go back in poverty, so it's going to be interesting to see their reaction. But what concerns me, and what's also fascinating as a political scientist, is the fact that you have the United States losing power and influence, pretty much for quite a while. I look at 2005 as where it really started to bleed power and influence. Mm-hmm. You have rising powers. At the same time, we're losing power. You're seeing more international instability where conflicts are growing, adversaries are becoming more aggressive. And then you have this weak economy that's, on the brink and teetering. The conditions look ripe for something major out there.
Yeah, a great example, that's the BRICS, where, start out with 4, now something like 20 countries. And then the economists at times are disparaging about the idea of a BRICS currency. I go, no, you're missing the important point. The BRICS story is not about a currency, it's about alliances. We've got Russia and China and Brazil who are now part of a 20-country alliance and growing, in which they're saying, we're going with these guys now. And so you've got the Middle East turning us, you got Saudi Arabia turning on us. And so forget about a BRICS currency, the alliances are shifting. And so this is the fourth turning model. Ray Dalio's sixth turning. Ray has 6 cycles. I would say that it doesn't look good, and our politicians look like idiots. I don't see the leadership. As a political scientist, I would say that you probably pulled your hair out. That's a good way of putting it. You watch Tucker Carlson and Putin. 2 years ago, I wrote about the Ukraine war. I think it's my best writing, where I took Putin's side and I laid out the whole story. I pulled there's about 40 people who were seen, and they went all into the Nazi infusion in Ukraine and the various promises made and broken by NATO and things like that. So I wrote about that. I got to the end. I basically said, look, this war is NATO's fault. Russia superficially looks like the aggressor, but if you lined up Russian troops on the Mexican border and we took them out, would we be the aggressor? I don't think so. Putin played his best card, in my opinion. He was forced to play that hand. So I don't have anything against Putin. I'm sure he's tough. I'm sure he's ruthless. I'm sure he's a psychopath by Western standards. But I also am sure that Trudeau couldn't run the country. Biden couldn't run the country. No one we have could run that country. Putin's running that country.
And, when we look at Putin, I always look at him as a cross between, Tsar Nicholas and John Gotti. That's what he reminds me of.
Yeah. That's not a bad description. Yeah.
I think it's pretty good because he is like a mob boss to a large degree. But at the same time, I mean, when we look at it, leaders of countries are going to look out for what's in their nation's interest. Now, he made a.
Are you sure about that?
Well, yes. I'll rephrase that. Leaders are supposed to look out for what's in their country's best interest. Being in the United States and watching the Western culture and the Western civilization destroy itself through a number of self-inflicted wounds and stupidity. So I digress. But when we're looking at a country like Russia, it's amazing to me because essentially you had the Biden administration sit there, allow the invasion to occur because there was no threat of any type of pushback against Putin. You could take a small piece, that's okay. But then he puts on sanctions on Vladimir Putin, and he says that we're weakening Russia. And for a while, it looked like the military certainly was weakened, Russia's military, and we overestimated their military. But like any military, they adapted, they re-strategized, they saw the failures that they had in the beginning of the conflict, and so they recalibrated. Russia's economy or GDP is now bigger than it was before. They're selling more oil and gas than they were before. It's a wealthier country now than before the war. Didn't our leadership just empower Putin even further?
They did. I mean, it was like the immune system getting challenged and then coming out stronger in the end. Putin underestimated NATO's willingness to cause trouble. So Putin, I believe, was responding to the Azov battalion sort of Nazism in Ukraine, the risk to Russia of not having access to Ukraine. They didn't need to own Ukraine; they needed access through Ukraine. And then there was a serious ethnic cleansing going on in the Donbass region, and it was picking up. And so one of the theorists out there says that Putin would have waited, but the ethnic cleansing was amping up. And so he said, time to go, got to do it. And so, most Western observers don't know that tens of thousands, I've seen 14,000 is the estimate actually, of ethnic Russians were slaughtered by these Azov battalion guys. So when Putin referred to Tucker about denazification, he wasn't joking. I mean, the CIA funded and armed and trained Nazis in Ukraine to fight Russia. And Putin warned us repeatedly over the last 12 years, stop doing this. Russia can't tolerate this. You have got to stop. And some people like to say, well, Putin doesn't have the right to say that. I go, yes, he does. Right? That's superpowers do. And so if we will say, stop, moving troops into Mexico. And you can say, oh, you can't do that. And I go, yes, we can. That's how the world works, right? So Putin warned us over and over and over. And he finally, so I think the mistake he made is he thought he could move essentially what was a police force into Ukraine. So it was 50,000, right? You could take over Ithaca with 50,000. You can't take over Ukraine with 50,000. And then the question becomes, so how did he respond? Well, he took what was a peacetime military, which was not ready for a war, I think, and turned it into a wartime military, which is. They apparently have way more tanks than all of Europe combined. So,
yeah, well, and we could see, I mean, listen, Putin certainly learned from all failures, right? I mean, he didn't use his air superiority because He looked at it, if he destroys the country's infrastructure, then he
He's
has
got to
to
rebuild
rebuild
it.
that country.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
he didn't want to get caught in the position that we were in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And we tried to hang that on him. We tried to tell our populace that Putin was going to destroy the infrastructure, and there's not a shred of evidence of that. Putin did not try to, if you look
And
at
he
his
could
early
have if he wanted
moves,
to.
oh, absolutely could have. But in his early moves, he did nothing to destroy the infrastructure, except for maybe the Azov steel mill, where all the Nazis were hanging out. And he denazified that little bugger. So Putin, the other thing is some of the sharp observers said, look, Putin's going to fake like he's attacking cities to draw the Ukrainian troops to defend the cities. And then he's going to go around the cities and do what he has to do. So during the war, we would get these breathless news stories about how Putin's retreating. And we didn't know, the people who haven't paid attention, didn't realize that that was his plan, was to suck him into Kiev or Kiev, or how you want to pronounce it. And then circle around Kiev and get to where he wanted to go, which was to get to where the Nazis were, to get to where the military was, and to scrub them clean. I'm sure that there was some brutality. I mean, it was an ethnic cleansing of their own. But so here's where we've lost, right? This is the horror of the story. So the estimates, I believe, are maybe 500,000 dead Ukrainians. Does that make sense to you?
That's what I'm hearing.
Right. So we got 500,000 dead Ukrainians in the prime of their lives. We got 500,000 Ukrainian mothers lost their sons. We have now, because we forced him to play a much tougher game, he has now destroyed a lot of infrastructure. And so now
and he too lost about 250,000 soldiers.
Do we know that? I would put a lower number on that, but could be. And the point being is that in the end, if you had to bet a paycheck, you'd probably bet that he's going to get what he needs.
Well, that's the idiocy of our politicians, though. I mean, Russia was always the more dominant military. There was no disputing that. They were a stronger country, more powerful, more dominant, and Putin could play the long game, right? They could just keep on throwing bodies. They don't have the Vietnam syndrome like we do in the United States, where Americans don't like to see soldiers coming home in body bags. Within Russia, Putin's going to do all it takes, because he knows that if he loses this conflict, well, he's dead too. They actually have accountability in Russia. If you lose a war, you die. And
well, so I remember when everyone in the U.S., the idiots, the real morons like Lindsey Graham and guys like that, and I'm a Reagan Republican, so this is not left-wing candy-ass thinking. This is looking at it saying we shouldn't be doing this thinking, where they were saying we have to have regime change.
Yeah, because what comes next is going to be even worse than Putin.
And someone said, now Biden sounds like Reagan. I go, Reagan wasn't stupid enough to call for regime change. Reagan knew better than that. You never call for regime unless it's some banana republic dictator and you say, we're going to go take him out, period. But if you say you're going to take out Putin, you've now got to fight. Now you've got to fight. Because now you got a guy who says, look, they've given me no choice. It's a fight to the death. Pull out the nukes if we have to. Which, by the way, we were more risky than Russia was at pulling out the nukes. There's no question in my mind that Russia didn't want to pull out nukes. But
if they're going against Ukraine, they don't need to.
Right.
And didn't we, this shows you the failures of leadership. So you brought up Reagan, and you look at how Reagan handled the Soviets. You look at Nixon and how Nixon had the foresight to see that, even though communist China has more in common with Soviet Russia, Nixon was able to drive a wedge between the two countries. You look at the policymakers now, and it's Democrat and Republican policymakers, and they basically push Russia more towards China's sphere of influence, and they do policies that undermine what's in our best interest. I mean, if we would have forced a settlement between Russia and Ukraine within the first 4 months of the war, we would have been significantly more powerful. We would have had a weakened Russian military, a weakened Russian economy, and at the same time, a Ukraine that we pump so much money into that we get to dictate its policies. Instead, they let it go on. Now we have a stronger Russia, a stronger Russian economy, and a weakened Ukraine that looks like it's not going to survive. I mean, the idea of a democracy in Ukraine with Zelensky at the helm that suspends presidential elections is laughable. It's not happening. And the whole thing has turned into a catastrophic disaster, but it has real world ramifications, right?
Yeah. It's when you listen to to Putin get interviewed by Tucker, which scared the living crap out of the authorities, right? They were terrified of that interview because they knew full well Putin can handle tough questions better than any politician. He is by far the
Are
best.
you saying that President Biden can't sit for a 2-hour interview?
Yeah. I'm saying that. I know it is as appalling as that sounds. And Tucker was not recognizing what Putin was doing in the first 15 minutes where he gave a history speech. And I had two responses. One is, first of all, the U.S. citizens generally could use 15-minute history tutorials. We're not very good at history. Secondly, what Putin was doing is demonstrating his capacity to speak coherently in lurid detail for 15 straight minutes, knowing full well that if you imagine Biden doing, I've had this thought of doing the same interview with Biden, of Tucker Carlson interviewing Biden. Biden said, "Let me tell you about the history of the United States," and then just going wild with the bullshit.
Corn pop.
General Corn Pop at the Battle of Gaza Strip down on the Mexican border. And just go wild, right? There's so many things you could do, and makes the hair on your legs stand up. You could just go nuts with that satire. And I'm thinking of writing it, but I'm running out of time. So I think he was pulling what Trump did. And that is Trump, when he had a cognition test. And he stood up at the podium and he said, well, they asked me this, and I said this, they asked me that. And after about 5 minutes, you realize he just described in detail what they gave him in the cognition test, knowing full well that someone who knows Biden would say, Biden couldn't do that. I think now they're teeing up Biden to get him out. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that his protective mechanisms have been removed. And so I think they're teeing him up to go, but I don't know what their plan is.
Yeah, and I just have to say, I have to interrupt you for a second, because when we do look at that and understand, first of all, our intelligence communities have been planting the seeds that Putin's on his deathbed, that he's not going to be living that much longer,
that's a load
that
of
he's
crap.
really sick. And obviously that dispels that when you sit for a 2-hour interview. But more importantly, I mean, we just got Robert Hur's special counsel report basically saying that the only reason that Biden cannot stand trial is because mentally he's incapable of standing any type of trial. What does that do for adversaries around the world? I mean, we all saw it. We all kind of knew it. Now it's codified. Now it forces the media to cover Biden's mental shortcomings. But what are our adversaries taking? And do you see them growing more aggressive the longer Biden's in office?
Well, I got to figure the adversaries know that Biden's not running anything and hasn't been the whole way. So I'm not sure that changes much. I think if I were in another country looking in the U.S., I'd be nervous. I'd be going, you guys used to be kind of the Rock of Gibraltar. You were a pain in the ass at times, but otherwise, your Blue Water Navy could protect us when it had to. One person said something curious. They said that, by showing Biden has lost his marbles, and therefore they can't prosecute him. A, it tees him up to get out. B, it also says now we can go after Trump, and we don't have the problem of a Trump-Biden combo for taking the documents out of the White House. So now they said, okay, now that we've openly admitted Biden's lost his marbles, now we can go get Trump.
Yeah. Well, so, that they're certainly doing.
Well, in theory, I'm watching this Trump thing. He doesn't act like he has just even a whiff of fear that they're going to land any serious punches on him. Is it possible that he knows? It could just be him thinking it, right? It could just be Trump being Trump. It's also possible he knows, though, that this is just political theater and that there's actually no teeth in these charges.
Well, let's be honest. I mean, if he didn't say he was running for re-election, then these charges wouldn't be coming. So he knows it's political in nature. Now, getting into the mind of Trump is always impossible. But if we look at it, if we look at the basis of cases in New York, it's a BS case with untested legal theories being brought. The FEC and the FBI looked at this and said it was nothing. You have the Georgia case where you're trying to charge 19 people with racketeering. Now you got the lead prosecutor in her own corruption scandal, likely to be taken off the case. A new
And
prosecutor.
isn't that case based on sort of the idea of Trump saying, make up 11,000 votes? Isn't that sort of the premise of that case?
Correct. They took
Now,
11 seconds
here's
of
what
a
Trump said.
recording rather than the 2 hours. He didn't say
What
make new votes. He said
he said,
find the
fine.
fraudulent votes.
That's exactly right. And so in fact, that's a completely rational, legal thing to do. It
Yeah, I believe
reminds me a
Hillary
little
Clinton
bit of.
did that.
It reminds me of the full transcript of that neo-Nazi protest down in what is it, South Carolina, where Trump got pegged with saying these are good guys when that's not what he said. They just make this shit up. Our biggest problem, I think by far our biggest problem is the fact that our press is now completely and utterly fallen apart. I think if we had a robust press, this would all be a self-correcting mess. I think it's the corruption of the press that makes all these other things possible.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I mean, the media industrial complex has been
Unbelievable.
shameful, but if you look at it, it's the revolving door, right? Many of the people
I
in the
know.
press are worked for former administrations. They go into the press, so it's a revolving door. And then they all come from the same background, right? That think mentality. All the it used to be that you would have, people from farms going to New York City to become reporters, and people in the city that wanted to be. Now it's everyone goes to these four-year university bubbles. They get the same message drilled into them, and they become part of the press. So it's that groupthink mentality. But when we look at the document case in Florida for Trump, I don't think he fears that, because Florida is now Trump territory. I mean, you're going to find a friendly jury. I think the January 6th case in D.C. is probably the most dangerous, simply because of the judge and the jury in that case. I mean, you are not going to find a friendly jury that doesn't have their mind made up about Trump at this point. And so that's probably the biggest threat to him. But then again, there's also perils in that one as well.
Well, so I would argue that Biden, of all his idiosyncrasies, and on the one hand, I say, look, he's nuts by medical definitions. So in some sense, don't blame him. But before he was nuts, he was a pretty evil guy, right? I mean, he has pretty seedy approaches to politics and stuff like that.
And he was nasty. People make it like he was a nice guy. He was
a
always a nasty guy.
pathological liar, right? So I hold him accountable. I really do think he's a despicable human being. But his administration, the thing that they've done that to me is treasonous at the highest level, which could be, selling ourselves to China or to Ukraine or to who knows how many other countries in the world. The one that I think makes them treasonous is the weaponization of the Department of Justice. So now as a citizen, I look and, I'm writing about some dicey stuff, and I'm thinking, how do I protect myself? And the answer is you can't if they decide to unleash the Department of Justice on you. You will not survive the Department of Justice coming for you. The law being on your side means nothing. And that I would not have said 5 years ago.
Well, I mean, I've been witnessing the weaponization for quite some time, actually, and I've been tracking it, the government abuses.
I'm not into it.
Yeah. So when I was looking at it, I mean, one of the biggest turning points for me was when the CIA was caught spying on the members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and there were no repercussions for that. And the Senate is the one with oversight, the Senate and the House, and yet not a single person held accountable. And I said, something is seriously wrong with that picture. But I want to get your thoughts, because.
But now the little guys, now Joe Sixpack, though.
Yeah, now it's parents at school board meetings, traditional Catholics going to mass.
This is no longer people of wealth and power getting away with being punks. This is authoritarianism.
And that to me is the biggest threat right there. So I want to get your thoughts on my idea. Now, my audience isn't the biggest fan of this idea of mine, but if Trump were to win, I think that he should immediately pardon Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, almost as an olive branch.
Sort of Gerald Ford-like, right?
To a certain degree. But as he's doing it, he needs to clearly state that, okay, there was wrongdoing, the pay-to-pay schemes, the Biden family business, but say we need to focus our attention on the nameless and faceless bureaucrats that are in the system that have used ideology as a weapon to target political opponents. And now it's time to clean house as far as the bureaucracy goes, because the bureaucracy will be here longer than the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. It will be here longer than any one person. Do you think that would be the right approach, rather than focus on political battles with opponents like between Trump and Biden, focus on the abuses within the bureaucracy and begin to dismantle this federal bureaucracy that is way too large, way too bloated, has grown out of control, and shows they can't be trusted with power?
Yeah, I understand that. There's people who might want to see Biden. So I have two totally opposing views. One is I kind of want Trump to get in there and focus on, like you said, really constructive things. The other lobe of my brain wants revenge. and so I'm a little torn. So it'd be kind of fun to watch him go Leroy Jenkins on the people who deserve it, but it would not be necessarily constructive. So pardoning, I think I wouldn't pardon the Bidens right away. I think I'd let that lurk for a while, but I would day one pardon. And if I couldn't do it surgically, I would do it across the board, the January 6th prisoners. I would just sweep it right across. There are probably guys who are in jail who deserve to be there. But if you can't figure out who, then you just a full sweep. Just take them all and let them all out. And that would be my first day in office. And then I'd worry about the other stuff. But it would be nice if he stayed focused on improving. Now, I have this theory that Trump is a different guy than he used to be. So Trump was, first of all, if you actually look at his history, he's pretty successful at doing things. People like to talk about how he went bankrupt. Commercial real estate developers go bankrupt technically all the time because they set up these shell companies, and sometimes the project goes bust. It's just the way it is. But he's generally pretty successful. He's way more street savvy than a lot of people want to give him credit. At one point he built an office building without getting any of the signatures required, and he somehow pulled it off. My wife was appalled by it, and I go, that's chutzpah, right? That's really pretty cool. And then he was building one of his towers, and the concrete union went on strike, yet he was somehow getting concrete. My wife's going, that means he's tied with the mafia. I go, what that means? He got the job done. He found a way. And it might be by humoring the mafia, but he found a way. And so I think he is potentially the guy to clean it up. I also think he has what I call weaponized narcissism, where he used to be, I want my name on everything. I think he's realized that for him to be truly great, which the narcissist would want to be, he has to actually be a great president. And he can't just bloviate about himself. He's got to actually achieve something. So I get this feeling that the next 4 years would be an attempt to leave a real mark on society.
Well, one of the things that I always found mind-boggling was it's not like he's someone that's some hardcore conservative. I mean, let's be honest. He turned to the Republican Party in 2011, and that's when he became a Republican. He's certainly liberal on more social issues, yet he came in and actually governed a little bit conservative. But more importantly, what was bizarre was Democrats' reactions, because here's a guy that you could actually work with and probably get a lot of what you want if you just negotiate, because he did want his name on things.
Yes.
Whereas if you get rid of him and you had, let's say, a Mike Pence as president, you're not negotiating on any of the social issues with Mike Pence. I mean, he has deep conservative convictions. So do you know why there's such a visceral reaction among Democrats and even some Republicans when it comes to Trump?
I think it's possible. This is what I've been writing about and studying and stuff, and I'm not sure we should go into it, but I think it's possible there's so much dirt on them. Insidious, horrible, unbelievably bad dirt that they're just terrified that they're going to. Remember when Hillary said we're going to go to prison? That might have been more important than a lot of people give it credit. There are a lot of people I think could go to prison if he decides to start releasing information, and he might now, because that would be the revenge mode. Release the papers, release the Kennedy assassination papers, right? And when he was asked why he didn't, he said, you wouldn't want to see what's in there. You know, that sort of thing. So he might
Well, now I
release.
really want to see what's in there.
Yeah, I know. I figure the ones they're releasing, they're doctoring anyways. And I've been studying child trafficking a lot. It's the darkness of that story is so unbelievable, and it catches people who you'd be shocked by. And in fact, the reason I've been studying it is because I've been trying to figure out why people like Biden do things that just don't make sense, right? So you say, well, why open the borders? How could you possibly do something that looks so contrary to who we are in terms of how to run the country? It just seems so doesn't make sense. I go, well, if
And it's
someone
so
owns them,
obvious.
it's so obvious, and so someone owns them, and so the question is, what would cause someone to be owned? And then you get to Epstein, and you go, well, Epstein probably owned 1,000 people, right? I mean, I would think 1,000 would be a wildly good guess over his entire career, sure. That I think the child trafficking story is much bigger and runs much deeper than people realize. And the stuff I've read, the problem is you don't have good source material. So you read it and you go, how do I know that's true? But it's horrible. So for example, if what I've read about Hillary is true, she would be hung from the neck until dead. She would be tried and convicted and hung from the neck until dead for the things she did in the trafficking world. So I was talking to a Department of Defense caseworker, case agent, whatever you call them, on a Zoom call a couple weeks ago. A guy named Anthony Schaefer. And he seemed very honest. I was Googling him during the Zoom call to check some things to see if what he said seemed to be true. And he was connected. And at the very end, I said, look, I'm interested in child trafficking. And he said, he started talking about Epstein. I said, no, we all understand the Epstein story. We all understand there was huge amounts of blackmail. Huge number of people don't want their names coming out. You know, that we've got. I said, let me come at this from a different angle. Let me ask you a simple question. I said, is the Clinton Foundation trafficking children? And he said, absolutely. Now, if you take that as if you accept that answer, you realize, whoa, there's a world that I have not been paying attention to. And then I like to ask people who are shocked by this interest. I said, okay, so there's estimated from official sources between 500,000 and 10 million kids a year disappearing. Where are they going? All these different treatises, all this different child trafficking stuff, you never see the consumer. Sound of Freedom, no consumer. You name it, no consumer. And you got to find a model that explains how you could consume 1 to 10 million kids. And when you start digging into it, you go, oh, that could do it.
Yeah, there definitely has to be power centers in place for that. You know, I think, but like you said, I think the hardest part is the source material. Being able to say, you know, this is absolute fact that can't be disputed. Here it is.
And you
Here's the
can't
evidence.
you can't do it. You can't do it. You also notice the people who talk about it in brutal terms don't name living people.
Yeah.
They don't name living people. So but you'll get someone like Archbishop Vigano, very high up in the Vatican, saying that, you know, that the world is run by people who are pedophiles. You'll get former UN secretary, I can't remember his name, but from some years back, saying that, quote, pedophilia is the currency of geopolitics.
Crazy.
And so as I've dug into it, what I found is this very, very dark world that if it's true, then this is a matrix moment, the red pill. This is a red pill moment of a kind that most people. So if I try to tell people in detail what I've discovered just from reading stuff, like there's a site called 50 Voices of Ritual Sacrifice, where there's 50 adults who talk about what they went through as kids. And you go, if I can't imagine, it's a beyond Jeffrey Dahmer's level. It's beyond Jeffrey Dahmer's. And you go, if that's true, then there's stuff going on in this world that's so off our radars.
And so horrific.
And so horrific that it stays off our radars because so when someone is a victim of this and they come forward, they they're easily destroyed. They've already been destroyed once, right? They're already schizos, multi-personalities, junkies. They're destroyed. They're individuals who are attempting to piece together lives that have been shattered. And so they're easily destroyed. One of the great Rosetta Stones is the Franklin scandal. If you read about the Franklin scandal, it's in Omaha, Nebraska. And it's not that it's a big network, but it shows you what happens when the thing starts to unravel and how the FBI comes in and destroys the victims and makes sure that the thing does unravel. And the newspapers destroy the citizen group that's trying to get it to unravel. And the Attorney General of Nebraska tries to destroy the case. And you go, wow, that means that people way, way, way up the food chain are trying to make sure this pedophilia ring does not unravel. And so that might be the way to explain the unexplained decisions being made by powerful people.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock. Nothing would shock me in this day and age anymore.
Let me tell you. Let me make a distinction. It wouldn't surprise you. It would still shock you.
Yeah, all right. That's a good distinction because let's face it. I mean, nothing surprises anymore, especially the way we react to things and the way our government has been. It's shown that it's too large and needs to be reined in. There's a reason that limited government is the best form of government. Dave, I really appreciate you joining me today. And what's your Twitter feed so everyone can follow you?
It's a David B. Collum, Collum. I write an annual year in review, but it's gotten to the point where it no longer reviews the world. I have to be so selective in my topics because there's now so much material per year that I can't cover it. But it's my pinned tweet, and it gets distributed pretty broadly. And that's pretty much it. Podcasts, you just go to YouTube, search my name, and there'll be others like you trying to figure out what this wacky guy in Ithaca's getting into now.
Sounds good. And we'll have links up at the P.A.S. report website, PASreport.com, so everyone can check it out there. Dave, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.